Thank you. So I did just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge the suffering in Syria and Turkey at this moment, just to give it a few seconds thought before we begin. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Patricia Rosenmeyer. I'm the faculty director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the annual lecture on Sephardic Judaism, which is made possible by a generous anonymous gift to the center. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to take a couple of minutes to make sure you all know about our other upcoming events at the center, including an online emerging scholar talk on February 20th, and our March 2nd, 20th anniversary celebration, which is featuring a reception and a jazz performance with Israeli musician Daniel Zamir. So I really hope that you can join us. And event details are on our website, thanks to Karen Gajewski in the back of the room there. These events are made possible through generous gifts to the center. In fact, everything we do at the center is made possible because of the support of alumni and friends. So if you'd like more information, please visit us at jewishstudies.unc.edu. I'd now like to introduce our speaker. It's Ben-Dor, who is professor in the Department of History and the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. And he's also associated with NYU's Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. He's the author, and I have to read it from a paper since there's so many titles here, very, very prolific author, but he's the author of The Tao of Muhammad, A Cultural History of Muslims in the Late Imperial China, that's Harvard 2005, The 10 Lost Tribes, A World History, Oxford 2009, which shows the extent to which the search for the lost tribes of Israel became over 2 millennia an engine for global exploration and a key mechanism for understanding the world. If you look it up online, it has a beautiful cover as well, I have to say. He's co-editor of Modern Middle Eastern Jewish Thought, Writings on Identity, Politics, and Culture, and of The Scaffolding of Sovereignty, Global and Aesthetic Perspectives on the History of a Concept. His most recent co-edited volume is titled Time and Language, New Sinology in Chinese History, and that's coming out next month with Hawaii University Press. As you can tell from this impressive list, his work ranges widely over both Jewish and global topics. Tonight's lecture is titled, officially the title was Mizrahim and Zionism, 1893 to 1959, A History in Three Keys, but perhaps it's now the quest for history. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you so much. Yeah, can you hear me? Good. I would like to thank the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill for inviting me and the Center for Jewish Studies. It is an honor, and I'm happy to say that I'm here. It's the second time I'm here. I was here 4 years ago to talk about another topic, that now has matured into a book. This is the beginning of another book that I'm hoping to write. Actually, it's in Hebrew. You will hear the entire arc of it. It has an experimental beginning and it has an experimental ending. So I hope you stay with me with these two experiments that I'm doing. So originally the title was History in Three Keys, Mizrahim and Zionism. That's actually going to be the subtitle, okay? 3 keys, and I will go with 3 keys today. But I also want to talk about, the quest of history. And I will begin, what do I mean by quest of history? So if you think about modern Jewish nationalism, that after a rather quick period of evolution in the late 19th century, morphs into something that we call today Zionism, which is basically, it's a form of modern Jewish nationalism on one hand, but also centers on the Holy Land or the land of Israel as the place where, the Zionist aspirations or nationalist Jewish aspirations should be realized. Yes, there were other forms of Jewish nationalisms in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that focused on different things, on Yiddish as the national language, or on socialism as, an ideology that would be organizing, etc., etc., etc. Okay, but history basically gave rise to Zionism, as the dominant modern form of modern Jewish nationalism. And it implies, a certain history. Okay, and the history is that the Jews are a single unit, single nation, that moves steadily in history, as one unit, even though it is dispersed for most of its history. And certain events in history mandate two things. First of all, a return to a national homeland in the land of Israel, yes. And the second one is also, of course, that the history, the specific history of Judaism and the Jews, yes, basically gives it a certain, important traits that are today. The idea that you need to defend the land. In other words, if you think about, earlier Jewish homes and earlier Jewish polity, the idea that you need to defend the Jews, the idea that the land is a haven is not exactly there. I mean, that's a modern thing, and that's clearly derived, from a certain perception of history, okay? So, in order to have a nation, you have to have a national history, and that supposedly is unified. Here's where things get a little bit troubled, okay? Half of the population in Israel doesn't come from Europe, okay? And when we say Jewish history and Jewish experience, we mostly mean, Jewish experience in Europe, at least in the last millennia, okay? Which is a history of persecution. It's a history of, anti-Semitism. It is a history, of massacres and pogroms, and of course, the Holocaust. Okay. The question is, half of the population, or in the 90s, in earlier, it was, a significant minority within the European Jewish population in Israel, doesn't come from that history. Comes from the history. It comes from the Islamic world, where it had a completely different experience. Just to think about it, I mean, the whole idea of Christian-Jewish relationship is completely absent. Okay, and that, by the way, not only influenced the perception of history, it also influenced the way of Jewish law operates. Okay, because there are certain laws that have to speak to a Christian environment, rather than others. Think about questions of wine and others. Okay. Just this is just very, very clear examples. Okay. Then there are other issues as well. The dominant perception of history in Israel for many, many years was, European history. This is, first of all, reflection of the simple demographic of the Jewish people. The majority of the Jews in the 20th century were, and still are, Ashkenazic Jews hailing from Europe. Okay. Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews or Arab Jews, are a minority. Okay? Most of the significant occurrences, that was at least the perception, were in Europe. The implication also was, that the Jews are somewhat, at least, a European people. Let us think about Herzl. Herzl was designing or imagining a Jewish state, yes, in Asia, but it was supposed to be a European state. He even thought about it, speaking German and so on, and there's a famous thing that he says it's going to be, the first stand against barbarism, against Asian barbarism, etc., etc., etc. So from its conception, modern Jewish nationalism conceives of itself implicitly or explicitly as a European phenomenon, derived from European history, European histories of nationalism, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Now, that raises the question what to do, with people who do not come from that perception, who do not come from that experience. Okay, how do you turn them into Israelis? Okay, well, it's very easy. What you do is you basically educate them. Okay, and educating them means that part of it is you need to make them forget, their experiences in the past, or reshape them, or basically make the European Jewish experience in the East. Yes, and I'm going to talk about the East in a minute. Let's call it the Arab world, the Muslim world. Make it look like it's European. So there is an emphasis on, persecution. There's an emphasis, which there is, but certainly not on any scale, on a European level. There's an emphasis on the life of being as a minority, etc., etc., etc. Okay, that creates a certain distortion, in that. In addition to that, there's also an emphasis, in fact, that the leadership of the Jewish people comes from Europe. Okay. And of course, the leadership of Israel comes from Europe, and it translates itself in the terminology. For example, when you talk about migration to Israel from Europe, you talk about heroic pioneers. You talk about people like ma'apilim, people who climb, who really make an effort. Okay, But when you talk about migrations from the Arab world into Israel, you talk about mass migrations, as a multitude of people, are coming, who are nameless, who are faceless, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So there is a perception of history there as well that morphs into Israeli history as well. We're not now talking about the history of the Jewish people as a whole. We're talking about the history of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. Okay? Add to that another dimension that goes on, which is, the gaps that are forming very, very quickly and persisting to this day between what we call Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. In other words, there are gaps in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of labor, in terms of money. And, this is the reason why you have these gaps we can debate them forever, but no one disputes today that there are gaps, serious social gaps that persist well into the third, even in the fourth generation. Some people will argue that this is deliberate, and they analyze and they discuss the mechanisms. They assign, they say basically it's a process of racialization. Some other people say, well, it has to do with the fact of the time when you migrated, what were the conditions of the country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But no one disputes the fact that there are gaps. Okay, now. So what we have now in a situation, this is a very, very clear, very rough and rapid overview. What we have is a situation where you have actually two problems. One is that instead of creating one collective, yes, Israel, Zionism managed to create one collective of Jews we call Israelis. But within that collective, there are actually two collectives. Yes, one collective is known as Ashkenazim. That, by the way, most of them actually don't self-identify as Ashkenazim. They know that they're Ashkenazim, but they don't self-identify as Ashkenazim all the time. The general idea is that we are general Israelis, okay? And the other collective insists, on two things. First of all, we're different. Second of all, this is a divided society, yes? And we call ourselves Mizrahim. Now, who are the Mizrahim? They're Syrians, they're Moroccans, they're Yemenis, they're Iraqis, they're Persian, etc., etc., etc. From the greater Muslim world, mostly the Arab world, 9 Arab countries. Okay, if I can tell you that with the place where I grew up originally, it looked like the Arab League. Yes, because it had Moroccans, it had Iraqis, it had Yemenis, etc., etc., etc. In fact, Arabs were very, very united in that, more united than in the rest of the Arab world at that period. Okay, of course, all of them were of the same religion. Yeah. The point is that you have a group that basically had developed an identity that is super, that is above, the more localized identities, Iraqis, Moroccans, Yemenis, etc., etc., that basically says we are Easterners, Mizrahim. Yes, we are from the East. Okay, no one intended for that identity to emerge. No one. Yes, certainly not Ben-Gurion, certainly not Herzl. No one intended for that to happen. Yes, there were some early Zionist thinkers who were very conscious about the fact that they are going to create a country or build a state in the East, yes, in the Orient as it was conceived in Europe. And that was something that they were struggling with. I mean, the statement that Herzl that I made before is part of that. Okay? But at the end of the day, I mean, there is a certain collective that self-identifies themselves as Easterners. Okay? And that identity, to a great extent, is relational. In other words, you are an Easterner in relation to somebody who is a Westerner, in other words, an Ashkenazic Jew, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Now, the fact that you have a second collective who feels that its history is not represented. And if you look at early, if you look at Mizrahi thinkers such as Ella Shohat, maybe she was here, she talks from the late 80s at least about the erasure of Mizrahi history. Yes, people talk about the fact that it was erased because, the state of Israel wanted to twist everything, make everything, be more conform with European, with norms of, European Jewry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Also, there was the emphasis that, European Jews built the state of Israel. They produced Zionism, and basically the rest of the people were kind of, just hangers-on, and they came to Israel as a result of, other circumstances, not because they were good Zionists or pioneers, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Now that That discourse about the erasure of history is right to a certain degree. I don't agree with everything, but it's right. But there is a side to it that is kind of hidden. Over the years, and this is what I'm going to introduce today, over the years, there were persistent attempts by people who self-identified as Easterners from the very, very beginning, not just after 1948, to write alternative histories, if not of the Jewish people, but of Zionism, and also of, the collective that is known as Mizrahim, okay? And these books, this stuff, this material that is being written that I call histories, is never made in the mainstream. Until very recently, is never in the mainstream. You published it in samizdat, or dissident, journals, and I can name millions of them over the years that came out. Many of them were like one or single issue Mizrahi journals, that you put, in some Xerox machine or in some stencil and you distribute it, etc., etc. It happens in the 60s, it happens in the 50s, it happens later. So people write histories of Mizrahim. These are not professional historians who are in the universities. So I give you 3 examples. Ben-Zion Yosefov, okay? He writes in the early 80s and in the 70s. He's a member of the Zionist religious party, the Mafdal. Yes, this is, for me, a very important moment to actually give you a spectrum. This is not about right and left, okay? He writes a book called Democracy and the Cry, V'Za'akat HaMizrahim, and the Cry of Mizrahim, okay? The Cry, okay? And this book is actually talking about discrimination against Mizrahim within the Zionist religious political parties in Israel. The second one is Hamasecha, yes, the mask, yes, an introduction to ethnic strategy of the regime in the state of Israel. In other words, this is an alternative history of Israel, a 900-page book written by an Iraqi Jewish accountant. Only Iraqi Jewish accountant can write a book like this. Collected every piece of evidence, to establish the thesis that basically the gaps between Israel, Mizrahim and Ashkenazim in Israel are part of an ethnic strategy. Okay, in other words, there's a strategy and there's an ethnic strategy, etc., etc. That is an alternative history of Mizrahim in Israel. Okay, Bavel and Katrilevke. Okay, Katrilevke is very, very interesting. It's a reference, of course, to that shtetl that, Shalom Aleichem is immortalizing in the Pale of the Settlement. This is the ultimate shtetl in the Pale of the Settlement in the 19th century and perhaps even before. Katrilevke is like the place from which the Ashkenazim hail. Bavel is, of course, Iraq, but Bavel is also an opposition to that. It's the place where the Talmud was created. It is a time where, it's a place where, there was something that was radically different than, Jewish existence and Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Okay, and he talks about the birth of political Mizrahi Zionism. Okay. By the way, all of these printers, all of these people are like all sorts of presses that are completely unknown. Okay. It's a samizdat, to use the Russian term, dissident histories. Okay. And again, if you want to do this, history, the archives don't even exist. You need to invent the archive and look for that material. Okay. However, today we are in a completely glorious world. We have been redeemed. We're great, because today an alternative history of Mizrahim in Israel, yes, is the mainstream. Is a bestseller. It comes out in the largest press in Israel, the Sfarim, yes, by this author who is one of the most important journalists in Israel today. He appears daily on TV. He also has a PhD in religious studies, which is very, very important. Studies Jewish religion. Very, very important. I'm going to make a big deal out of it towards the end, in the second experimental part. Okay? And this is a book that is called Second Israel, yes, the sweet, how to say Besorah? Yeah, don't take it. Yeah, Besorah means message, but it means good news, and it means good news in the evangelic sense of the word. Okay, and then Habesorah Metuka Hadikui Hamar, the bitter oppression. Okay, so we're talking about an alternative history that talks about, a group of people, who are now classified as second Israel as opposed to first Israel, and they come up with a very, very sweet a message, yes, but they are bitterly oppressed. Okay, and then of course you see there, you have a very important, most important Sephardic jurist in the second part of the 20th century, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Yes, and you have Menachem Begin, and of course, Benjamin Netanyahu. Yes, our dear beloved leader who recently came back. Now, if I have to summarize, what is a Mizrahi intellectual? A Mizrahi intellectual has three functions, okay? First of all, he needs to identify the Orient, okay? Because if we say that we are part of the Orient, we need to define where it is, because the Orient is, of course, a geographical category that has loaded political and cultural identities, but the Orient is somewhere, okay? I, by the way, am a student of Chinese history, and in Chinese history, if you ask where's the Orient, they will tell you in Japan, because it's to their east, okay? The second thing is to define Mizrahiness. In other words, okay, we have this collective, but we need to see what makes us a collective, okay? And of course, this is a matter of big debate, yes? And the third function is, of course, what intellectuals always have been doing. You have to tell a story, and you have to tell a good story. I'm telling a story today. I hope it's good, okay? So these are the three functions that I would like to talk to you about. But before we begin with all of that, we need to basically identify the Orient and identify, in fact, how people in the world began to identify as Orientals. In other words, if some Jews today say that we are Orientals, we are Mizrahim, okay? First of all, how other people came to be Mizrahim, okay? How Japanese people or Moroccan people, people east and west of France or Germany identify as, something that we call the Orient, okay? So there are two explanations. One explanation, of course, is that, with the rise of European imperialism in the early modern and the modern period, European intellectuals began defining the world, dividing the world to an east and west, and basically re-identified some areas as the world as the Orient, Egypt, India, China, the Muslim world, ancient Persia, ancient Egypt, etc., etc. So that was the Orient. But that didn't mean that the people who lived in those areas identified as Orientals, okay? So, and this is a crucial question for us. If we have Israelis who come and, they come from Morocco, which is basically in the West, and begin to say we're Orientals, there's a question, okay? Now, this is an experimental thesis of mine that I'm kind of in love with it. Walk with me, okay? I'm taking you to 1905, to the Russian-Japanese War, and to a place called the Straits of Tsushima, which is right around here. It says that there, it's between Korea and Japan. And I'm going to tell you why, okay? So during that war, the Japanese, were fighting, which was a kind of a small nation just rising, an Asian nation, were fighting the Russian giants, okay? And it was a big war, and everybody was putting their money that the Russians are going to win. But the Russians were struggling because they didn't have ways to really deploy a lot of troops in East Asia, because the train that crosses Siberia was not finished yet. So, in fact, Japan had sort of an advantage. So what did the Russians do? The Russians decided to send the entire Baltic Navy, or the Baltic Navy, all the way from there. You see there in Lithuania, that area there in the Baltic Sea, all the way to send it to Japan. Okay? And the assumption that the whole world assumed that once the Russian Navy is going to get to Japan, the Japanese are going to be crushed by the mighty the Russian Navy. Okay? Now, I should mention to you that this is the first war that actually occurs when the world is connected via telegraph. Okay? So the entire world is now connected via telegraph, which means that news travel fast. Okay? So the Baltic Navy, sets sails out, and they cross, they go through the La Manche Canal. They make it through Western Africa. They do kind of a Magellan journey all the way. They get into the Indian Ocean. They cross the Straits of Malacca, and by the time they come to this small place called Tsushima, right here, yes, a small Japanese squad of boats stings them, like it was like a beautiful ambush, and they are destroyed. Now that's a sensation in the world because news spread immediately, and it's a very, very serious sensation. These are maps about that. This, by the way, was the first battle that was actually almost broadcast live, via the telegraph. In other words, imagine that, everybody is like basically watching to see what's going to be the outcome. And everybody is convinced that the Russians are going to win. Okay, well, they didn't. Okay. And of course, it causes the major sensation. The hero is a Japanese admiral named Togo Heihachiro, yes, not to be confused with Admiral Tojo, the war criminal from World War II, okay? So Togo is, of course, he's the one who presides over that, and he wins, and it becomes a series of sensations. This is the Russian admiral who was defeated. The entire world is reacting to this sensation, okay? In the West, panic. The first time that a non-European / non-white power defeated a European power in centuries. In fact, it didn't happen, since the last battles between the Turks and the Europeans in Europe. Yes, Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, he expressed fear that the reverberation of the victory, the Japanese victory, have gone like a thunderclap through the whispering galleries of the East. Okay. Now, he already imagines the East as one unity because he lives in the West. Yes, he's like basically an imperial planner. But that doesn't mean that the East is imagining itself as the East. Okay. Let's see. So this is just one person. Let's go to some other reactions. So in the East, yes, in the so-called East, now you have like serious celebrations. In South Africa, a man named Mohandas Gandhi, I think you heard about him. He boasts, he says, so far and wide have the roots of Japanese victory spread that we cannot now visualize all the fruit it will put forth. In India, Nehru, yes, he says, I'm dreaming of an Indian and Asiatic freedom, upon hearing the news, okay? Tagore, who was a teacher in Bengal at that time, he basically said, when I heard the news, I left the class, I left the school, and I took a walk. Okay, this is apparently when you're a serious Indian philosopher, that's what you do. You take a walk. Okay, Kemal Atatürk in Damascus. Yes, that's not yet, the leader of Turkey. He was simply ecstatic. W.E.B. Du Bois. I know, not from the East, a very prominent African-American scholar and sociologist. He speaks about this event as an instance of colored pride. Okay, in Tehran, okay, an anonymous poet writes a book, which is called the Mikado Name. He like the Shah Name, he wants to praise the Japanese emperor. And I think he was so excited. That's the only poem that he ever wrote. Published it in Calcutta that year. In the Ottomans, you have other intellectuals, they basically praise that. They say the Japanese nation in arms are a role model for nationalism in the Ottoman army, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Sun Yat-sen, the future leader of the Chinese nation and the founder of the Chinese nation, was in prison in England at the time. He said, I had a good laugh when I heard the news, yes, about the Japanese victory. Later that year, he took a boat from London all the way back to China, and he stopped at the Suez Canal in Port Said. He took a walk when the boat was like just staying there. He took a walk, and Egyptian porters ran into him to greet him and to congratulate him because they thought he was Japanese. Okay. And he wrote later about it. He remembered that he said, this something was like so great for us, because the Japan's victory of Russia, made us feel, proud in our being Asiatic people, etc., 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 etc. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit because I want to go to this man. Okay, now, so in a way, my theory or my thesis is that that was the first time you can see clearly that people united over one outcome of this war, and that there was a sense that here the East defeats the West. And we can basically draw a line. If you were panicked about the results, you were from the West. If you're happy about it, you're from the East. And that's the unity, because The porters in Egypt have nothing to do with the samurais or with the descendants of the samurai in Japan, not culturally, not anything. But suddenly they feel that they are part of one group, yes, in that context. Now, two Jewish parents in Egypt who had a son that was born in 1901, you know, decide to nickname their child, you know, there were plenty of Togos being born because of that admiral. A lot of people called their child Togo as a result. So the founder of Egyptian cinema, now that there's a wonderful biography by Deborah Starr about him, his name is, he gets the name Togo Mizrahi, and he's known as Togo Mizrahi for the rest of his life. That's a nickname, yes? So I surmised, you know, that since the nickname was given him to as a child at that period, you know, that he was the first Togo, yes? And in a way, he was also the first Mizrahi, in the sense that, you know, his parents clearly did it as an act of identifying with the Japanese victory, okay? So he's the first Mizrahi Jew, to a certain extent, in the idea that what we have here is a case of self-identification that is quite conscious, and it is relational to the West. And this is before the evil Ashkenazim have even been invented, okay? And here he is again, okay? Very, very important career and so on. So the point is that there is a sense of an Orient that is now rising, that is discovering itself. There is a sense of an Orient that is not defined by the West, you know, by the departments of Orientalist scholars in the West, but actually is defining itself again. And the war and the Japanese victory has a clear impact on that. And here I want to introduce the first key, Chaim Ben Kiki. Chaim Ben Kiki was born in Tiberias in 1887. He was the grandchild of Moroccan rabbis that moved to Tiberias in the 1840s, and they were part of a very, very important community in Tiberias at this period. He had a rabbinic education, okay? He was a very, very learned man. He knew Arabic really well. He loved Arabic, okay? And he was buried in Aden, and I'm going to mention how he ended up being buried in Aden in 1935. Okay, so here's his basic biography. I'm going to tell you a little bit. You can read it while I speak. You know, he was a Sephardic intellectual, North African descent. His father was a very important rabbi, in fact, the chief rabbi of the Tiberias rabbinic court. And this man is very, very active, you know, and he writes a lot in the Hebrew press of the time, in the 1910s and in the 1920s, scathing critiques of Zionism at that time. And he writes that, you know, this is his father. This is a book, you know, that his father wrote about Jewish law. Okay, he himself had rabbinic training, of course. Okay, although he professed that he loved the Quran a lot. This is his family. Yeah. And just to tell you something about the community of Tiberias, one of his friends was a man named Bechor Shitrit, you know, who was the first minister of police in the newly created Israel in 1948. There were other important members from the Tiberias community. All of them, in fact, are of Moroccan descent, you know, but they are several generations before. And some of them actually become quite prominent, you know, in the Yishuv, but also later on in the early state of Israel, okay? And he writes, first of all, he begins to write from Tiberias. He's one of those people who write all the letters to the editor, you know, and he has articles, and he quarrels with people, and he has all sorts of things and so on. And he has serious critiques about Zionism in the sense that, you know, it basically, his main argument is Zionism isolates the Jews from the other peoples of the Middle East, okay? And the fact that he's from Tiberias means a lot to me, because the thing that has a serious impact on him is, in fact, an event that is kind of neglected when we think about the history of Zionism, which is the Franco-Syrian War. Okay? This is a war that takes place in 1919-1920, when the French mandate is installed in the newly created Syria. Okay? I mean, if you recall, Sykes-Picot in 1916, you know, divides the Middle East, creates all sorts of future states, future Arab states. And what happens is that when the French come in, you know, they take one territory, which is known as the Vilayet of Beirut, or the province of Beirut, and they create a new state called Lebanon, okay? Of course, Syria feels deprived, and there's a war between the French and the Syrians in 1919-1920. That war, yes, is known in the history of Zionism only because of one case, which is the case of the settlement of Tel Hai, where Yosef Trumpeldor and several or 8 other Zionist settlers, were killed by Syrians. Yes, but no one even knows the context. It's actually that event is part of the context of the Franco-Syrian War because it was also in the northern part of Israel. So if you live in Tiberias, you watch that a great deal. You watch that a great deal, and this is just more about the war and the outcomes of the war. It creates it takes all sorts of different states and creates Syria and creates Lebanon, etc. I'm rushing into show how it is. It also creates, in fact, the northern parts of mandatory Palestine, okay, as well as the results of that war. Okay, there was a settlement in 1923 that basically ended the war officially, and created the boundaries of what is today's northern Israel, Lebanon, and southern western Syria. Now, if you live in Lebanon, if you live in Tiberias as a Jew, you watch the outcomes of that as well. And what happens with Ben-Kiki, his critique of Zionism begins not because of what the Zionists are doing, actually because of what the Christians in Lebanon are doing. He said, most of his critique is about that. He said, look, you decided you want a state for yourself simply because you're Christian, okay? And, that has serious problems. It led already to one war. It led already to a division within, the peoples in the region. Okay, and that probably will have one of the first, I think, to understand that will probably have serious outcomes also to the divisions between Jews and Muslims in the Middle East itself, because this is what happens between Christians and Muslims. Okay, so my argument is that his critique of Zionism begins out of that. And to be very, very clear, he's a Zionist, yes? He believes that, the Jews should have a homeland in the Holy Land, all of that, okay? But he basically has a serious problem with the way European Jews are doing it, okay? So, for example, he writes a very important article, one of the first articles in which a man actually self-identifies with the Greater Orient, okay? And he says, the Orient is a unique customs and religion that greatly distinguish it from the West. Okay, so he operates with that division. Okay, and later on I will show you that when he imagines the Orient, he imagines it all the way to Japan. Okay, it's not just the Orient as the Middle East. Okay, and then he talks about all sorts of things. He says, well, the people in the Orient have a very, very different approach to life. Yes, have a very different approach to the way they see things. They have different opinions, they have different sages and prophets. He clearly doesn't mean the prophets of the Bible. He includes them, but includes other philosophers and other thinkers from the West as well. So he's actually operating with that division. Okay, and this is a beginning of a critique of what the European culture is doing to the East. Yes, and it is very, very interesting what he argues about that. He said, yes, when Europe realized that the Orient insists on remaining Oriental, yes, culturally, and not changing and not succumbing to European power, they started developing all sorts of sciences, that basically will reinforce the idea of Oriental inferiority. Okay, that's 58 years before Edward Said writes Orientalism. Okay, basically the argument that the European science studying the Orient are designed to establish the inferiority of the Orient vis-a-vis the West is written by a man living in Tiberias at that point. You can read the rest of it, I hope, etc. And he says all of these fears of Europeans about their political domination over the East is not enough. They need to actually come up with some ideologies that will justify it. Yes, that was the genesis of the idea of spreading Western culture in the Orient. The Europeans thought that by presenting the natives to their culture and its essence, the Easterners would come to appreciate it, yet they hardly managed to accomplish even a small measure of this goal. Okay, so it basically defines the entire European project, the entire cultural European project in the East, all the way from the Middle East, all the way to China, as sort of a failure that Europe needs to defend all the time. That's like very, very sophisticated thinking. If you think about the critiques of colonialism that spring, in the 70s and in the 80s and later on. That's already in the 1920s in Tiberias, not in Siberia. Yes, okay. And just read, if you read there, and he also talks about, how Easterners, some Easterners actually internalize that. Okay, think about post-colonial thought today, how much it is focused on the fact that, colonized people internalize, all of these arguments. Okay, so he says, yeah, they begin to, some of them got baffled by the diverse education, fashion, beautiful new customs, etc., etc. In other words, they were overwhelmed by modernity, by European modernity. And he critiques that, he's aware of that. Okay, and this man writes, okay, he also communicates with this man, a Karaite Jew in Egypt, who writes a lot, about Egyptian nationalism by the name of Murad Farag. They correspond. This is one of the beautiful letters that he writes to him. He says, like, the disease of laziness attacks me from time to time. The last time that you wrote to me, your sir wrote to me, about my article, European culture in the East. I didn't have time to send it to you, but now I'm sending it to you and so on. Like, this is 1920. Okay, I was insanely proud when I discovered that in the Museum of Jewish History in the 16th Street, where he really describes, the correspondence between these two men. One in Cairo and one is in, he writes from Haifa at that point. The point that I'm trying to make is that this kind of idea spread among Middle Eastern Jews at that time. At least some intellectuals are already communicating them. Okay, and of course, pay attention, he signs to him in Arabic. At the end, both of them know Arabic really, really well. Okay. His second article that I'm going to present here very, very quickly, is an article that he writes about the question of settling the land, which is published by Jabotinsky and by Itamar ben Avi, son of Eliezer ben Yehuda, who's the revival, associated with the revival of the Hebrew language, who they write there, we published this article, yes, but we disagree with the author, which is a beautiful thing to say if you think about it. I love it, and I love Jabotinsky and Ben Avi for saying exactly that, because, actually the Jewish right at the time was far more, liberal in terms of, understanding, less, I think, than the Jewish left, more than the Jewish left in, understanding that, you have to give voice to dissent, okay? And here he basically talks about the fact that, Zionism, particularly after the establishment of the mandatory government, is actually imposing a certain European way on the settlement in the land, and that will definitely lead to conflicts with Arabs. That's what he called the question of all questions. Okay? I don't think that I need to explain anything about that, because this is the history since then, that we're living. So, for example, he says, one of the problems that you have is that you ignore the locals. You ignore what he calls the Sephardic Jews, who actually live here, and he says their lives are embroidered with, textured together with the locals, with the Muslims and the Christians around here. He says something quite remarkable that I don't have it here. He says, look, you now came in, and instead of the traditional rabbinic establishments, you created something called the chief rabbi. And you brought this man who is going to be the chief rabbi of the land. But if tomorrow morning you will have a conflict in the Temple Mount or in the Wailing Wall, yes, when we used to have this violence before, so the Hacham Bashi, the Sephardic rabbi appointed by the Ottoman Empire, will go to the Mufti, to the leader of the Muslims, and they will decide, they will basically mediate and put an end to the violence. He says now you don't have that institutions anymore. What happens if you have another wave of violence there? Who's going to be the go-between? Where are you going to have the traditional institutions who are going to bring the people together and put an end to the violence before it escalates? Let me remind you, in 1921, first serious wave of violence around the Wailing Wall, Temple Mount, between Muslims and Jews. The British didn't know how to handle that. Escalated. And then 1929. We don't even have to talk about more. Okay? And then he says something really interesting. He says, yes, that one of the problems is that the Europeans, basically, since European Zionism is attacking the whole idea of assimilation, it's against assimilation in Europe, when they come to the Middle East, they see Jews who speak Arabic, they consider them assimilated, yes? Because they speak the language of the Gentiles in that context. Now, if you speak that in Europe, it's a problem, because that's why there's an insistence on Hebrew. He says, we never had an issue with that, okay? Why do you insist, that we forget Arabic and just switch to Hebrew? It's a question of communication, okay? And then he goes on, and he writes beautiful Hebrew, and he says, like, the whole problem is that you don't leave the Jew as he is. You fill their heads with all sorts of foggy ideas about nationalism and all sorts of other things. You want to change the Jews, and because you want to change the Jews, you don't just want to settle the land, you want to change the Jews, and that's going to breed more and more and more conflict. And he says you basically are not fit to carry the national program. In fact, at the end of this article, he actually suggests that, the European Jews will stay in Europe for a while. They will bring Jews from the Orient, and he names Tunis, Morocco, other countries. He names all of them as Eastern. He says, like, we will build the land, we will settle everything. We will create a nice land together with the Arabs, and then you will come, okay? That's a plan, okay? When I met I suspected that this man had his eyes on, Eastern thinking. Very serious Eastern thinking. But, like all the great intellectuals, he doesn't write with footnotes. So you don't know where he takes all his ideas. And there was a moment that I presented his original thoughts in Jerusalem. I said, like, I can't prove it, but this man actually was an avid reader of Tagore. I can't prove it because he never mentions Tagore, okay? Well, the next day, someone calls me and says, I'm his granddaughter, and my mother wants to speak with you. We heard you're studying our father, okay? So I go to visit his mother, who was in their early 80s at the time, and she said, listen, before I even start, my father loved Tagore. Okay? He loved Tagore. He had all of his books, and he had all of his commentaries, so on and so. So I found a lot of echoes of Tagore ideas about Eastern university, Eastern education, etc., etc., etc. This is, of course, Tagore. This is Einstein. Okay. In 1935, after a lot of quarrels with the Ashkenazic Zionism, Chaim Ben Kiki took on a boat in Jaffa. He gone on a boat in Jaffa, on a way to India. The idea officially was that he was going to just raise some money, in the Indian communities to bring to Israel. I don't think so, because I don't understand how you do philanthropy in India. But let's say he was. I think he went to meet Tagore. He wanted to meet Tagore, but he got typhus and got sick in typhus, and his body was taken off the boat in Aden, in the Red Sea, and he was buried there. Second key, Avraham Abbas. Now we're moving to 1958. Avraham Abbas is a Syrian Jew, okay, a very, very mega Zionist. He belonged to a party called Achdut HaAvoda. Now, if you think about Zionist socialism, yes, so you have people who are less Zionist, more socialists. You have people who are more Zionist, less socialists. Yes, Mapai, Mapam, Ben-Gurion, all of these people. Achdut HaAvoda, they were hardcore on both. Hardcore Zionists and hardcore socialists at the same time. The party of Tabenkin, okay? So Avraham Abbas was born in Syria. He came very early on to Israel. He was a very serious Zionist activist. Yes, he was a member of the Knesset and also the member of Achdut HaAvoda, and probably one of the most handsome Zionist socialists ever. Okay. Passed away very young. Okay. In 1958, he writes a very, very long essay full of details. Why he writes that essay? Because in 1948, in the early 50s, he was appointed as the person in charge of all Mizrahi Jews and Mizrahi labor in the Histadrut, which was a very, very dominant labor union, and basically a state within a state in Israel. Okay, so he actually had the actual real numbers about the gaps that have been creating since 1948, of the newly created Israel, where 800,000 Mizrahi Jews were coming in. Okay, he was aware of their conditions as laborers, as workers, etc., etc., etc. And he writes this piece in Hebrew, full of data, okay, full of social data, and it is translated into English very, very quickly. And it's called From Ingathering to Integration. Avraham Abbas. And the idea there that he basically says, okay, the gathering of all the galuyot, of all the exile is one project, but actually you need to integrate, okay? And the Sephardic Council in Jerusalem, translated the book very quickly, this little booklet very quickly into English because they were anxious to spread it in the rest of the world. They wanted to spread the news that actually something is quite wrong in the newly created Jewish state. And they talk about Abbas. Abbas passed away shortly after he wrote that piece, okay? And he wrote about that, and he says, you know, I mean, Mr. Abbas's public career, he was a very important, was a member of the Knesset, etc., etc. And for a long time, he was opposed to any separate organization by Sephardic and Oriental Jews. In other words, he was really a proponent of, you know, unity, you know, from above, you know, the way Ben-Gurion was dictating it. But something happened to him. He changed his mind. He changed his heart. You know, they talk about it as if the man had some sort of an epiphany, a very sad epiphany, okay? This is his funeral. You can see the Zionist leaders all over in the place. He was a very important man in this time, okay? Here he is. This is Tabenkin giving a speech in front of his body, in front of the surgeon's body, covered with the state of Israel. Okay. And they say he wrote that report because he realized something was very, very wrong. Yes, and he realized that the gaps that are being created between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim in Israel, you know, if we don't have an equitable solution, the survival on the state depends on an equitable solution, okay? So he talks about equity in 1958, 10 years after the state of Israel is created. That's very, very early to understand that now what we call Mizrahim are not located somewhere between, you know, India and Haifa. Yeah, the way, you know, Ben Kiki was imagining that, it's mostly as a cultural problem. The Mizrahim are now a social problem. And not only a social problem, you know, the fact that, you know, they are discriminated against, yes, is something that will cause a problem, and in fact, the survival of the state depends on, you know, equitable solutions for them, okay? And here is what he says. This is how he concludes the report. The conclusion is full of numbers showing, you know, that there are gaps between Mizrahim and Sephardim. He says, most of the Oriental Jews have been cruelly and bitterly, yes, disappointed, okay? And they have ceased to have any faith in the public declarations of the party leaders, that is the Labour Party that is ruling the country, about the true equality of the citizens of Israel, okay? So just before he died, this man, you know, had a complete realization, you know, a complete turning away. He talks about, you know, a whole collective of people that were brought to Israel to be redeemed, yes, to come, you know, to end exile and to be free, you know, and actually they are cruelly and brutally disappointed because of that, okay? Now, that piece is prophetic. Why is it prophetic? Because a year after it was published, and not because it was published, because there were other social dynamics going on at the time, the first instance of nationwide, what the government called riots, but we can call an uprising or rebellion, you know, starts in Haifa, where, you know, some Moroccan leaders, this is David Ben Harouche, the leader, you know, and you can see that they raised the Israeli flag. But this is an Israeli flag of equity, yes? You know, begin to rebel against, you know, discriminatory policies in Haifa, and for a very, very quickly, some of these incidents of violence, you know, are spread all over Israel. There is a great historian, Brian Roby, the University of Michigan, who wrote a book about that period, and he showed, yes, that in fact incidents of violence between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim over social issues were actually throughout the entire decade. This is just the peak moment, okay? So that article that I'm talking about writes a history. It's a short history because Israel exists only for 10 years. You know, he writes a history there and says, look, the history of Israel, the alternative history of Israel that I'm presenting to you, it's not a history of ingathering, yes? It's actually a history of discrimination, a history that actually created a very, very bitter collective, okay? And then right after that, you have violence. This is more pictures of the place in Haifa and so on. Which leads me to another person, okay? Who translated that piece into English? Okay, who translated Avraham Abbas into English? Well, the translator is one of the most interesting, you know, Jewish intellectuals. And again, all of them, you know, are kind of neglected and forgotten, etc., etc. A man by the name of Michael Seltzer, or Michael Seltzer. Okay. Michael Seltzer was born in Germany. And the family had to escape the Holocaust, escape Nazi Germany to British colonial India, where he spent time in the northern part of India, in today's Pakistan, actually in a camp because they were considered enemy citizens. Yes. Here he is. I found the archives of the family in Evo, and I used it. This is him in Lahore as a 7-year-old, and so on. This is his father. Michael Seltzer moves, experiences the division of India, experiences the anti-colonial struggle in India, and then at some point he moves to Oxford, where he becomes the leader of the Zionist student organization in Oxford. And then he migrates to Israel. And when he comes to Israel, he discovers actually that there are two collectives. Okay? And because of his experiences in India, he associates with the Mizrahim. Okay? And he begins to work with the Sephardic council. Okay? And he gives lectures about, for example, this is a book that he wrote, a book about the problems of the Jews of the East. Yes. Ethnic conflict in Israel by Michael Seltzer. Publisher is the Sephardic Council in Jerusalem. £1. Yes. And here he is. He had a hunger strike in front of the Zionist establishment, the Zionist headquarters in Jerusalem. And he was interviewed by a journalist to try to mock him. And he says, why? He says, I've been influenced by Gandhi. He says, I saw how the British treated the Indians in India, and I imitate Gandhi. I follow Gandhi. He says, Gandhi was a fantastic man, and I follow the same thing. And he had an hunger strike against protesting, discrimination against Mizrahim in Israel. Okay? And he writes a lot, etc., etc., etc. In 1965 or 66, he writes a book, The Aryanization of the Jewish State, in which he says the following argument. He says, why do Ashkenazic Jews hate Mizrahi Jews in Israel? Okay? And he says, here's why. He says, because what they really wanted is to create a European state in the East. And when they came to the land of Israel, yes, and they had to bring all of these Easterners, all of these Arab Jews from the Arab countries, and they remind them of their own Easternness. They remind them that in Germany, they were the Orientals. They were discriminated against. They were understood to be the Semitic, barbaric people, by the Europeans themselves. They come to the East in order to create their own European country and be finally European, and then you have all of these people who come and remind them, actually, no, you're just like us. You're just basically Arabs from the East. That's why they hate them. Now, if you think that this is a joke, let me tell you something. Hannah Arendt, who around the same time comes to Israel, to cover the Eichmann trial in 1962, writes the same thing. She talks about the Mizrahi policemen outside the gates of the trial, of the court, and she says they basically remind me of Arabs, okay? And the idea here is that these are Jews, but if you have Jews who are supposedly like you, look like Arabs, that's a little bit troubling, okay? Look it up in her book on the Eichmann trial, okay? More importantly, later thinkers such as Ella Shohat, who I mentioned, and others such as Aziza Kazum, very, very late, much later than Michael Seltzer, came up with the same argument. They say that part of the conflict is in fact that there was a Zionist desire to create a Western state in the Holy Land, and that actually didn't work because of a very, very large group of people who came from the East, and basically troubled the whole project. Okay. Michael Seltzer published his book in 1967 in New York, and he ended it with a prophecy. He said, I predict that there will be a rebellion. There will be a Mizrahi rebellion against the Ashkenazic domination, and that the Arabs and the Mizrahi Jews will unite together against that. He even said at some point that there will be an armed conflict. Okay. And when I wrote this book, I was in a certain disbelief. I spent 10 years, I published a quick article about him in 2004, and then I spent 10 years calling every single Michael Seltzer in the United States, 411. I said, are you the Michael Seltzer who wrote the Aryanization of the Jewish state? And everybody hung up. Until I discovered the family archives in Evo, and then I discovered through that, I actually reached the man, and we have some conversations. I hope to interviewing him a little bit more, and so on. He had a wonderful career. Look him up, wrote several very, very important books on stuff. Now, his prophecy didn't happen. But there was no rebellion. But in 1971, there was the rebellion of the Black Panthers of Israel. Okay? People were inspired by the Black Panthers movement in the United States, in Jerusalem, in Musrara, rose, and you can see here, fought for equity and fought for equality, for better distribution of the wealth, fought against discrimination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, this is 1971, not 1981. But in my own neighborhood where most of my family and I came from, in Jerusalem, there was another movement called the Tents Movement, fighting inequality with regards to housing, okay, called the Tents Movement in 1973. There's a wave of social unrest, in the big cities of Israel. And this is the 10th protest in 1980. This is a legendary leader named Yamin Suissa. Notice the Che Guevara there, protesting, the confiscation of land by the government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the name of the movement, okay? In 1990, just before Saddam invaded Iraq and started the Gulf War, there was another wave of protest all over Israel by Mizrahim, basically protesting again housing discrimination in terms of housing and housing inequality, mostly of housing. That part is completely erased from Israeli history and Israeli memory. Everybody likes to remember the protest of housing that the middle class, Ashkenazic middle class did in 2011 during the Arab Spring. That is kind of forgotten, but we're talking about actually of 20 years of very, very intense social activities in Israel at the time that are clearly defined by Mizrahim. And here he is, Yamin Suissa, basically said, he writes here and he talks about, Moroccans who are collaborators with the government. So he has this idea that, if some Moroccan Jews are collaborating with the government to actually erase, the fact that there is a difference, okay? And at that point, at the moment of the Ohalim movement, the tent movement, you see a bifurcation. We move into, political parties of Mizrahim in Israel, and the first serious one is Tnoat Masoret Israel, yes? The movement of the Israel tradition, and here is beginning to define the Oriental Jews, first of all, not because of by way of inequality and discrimination or Arabness or Orientalness, but actually they are simply nice traditional Jews. That's all they want to be, okay? And from that moment on, we begin to see something very, very different. We begin to see actually more and more focus away from social issues, although many activists did stay focused on social issues, but actually talking about what is Mizrahi identity. Suddenly the identity became a purpose unto itself. You need to express your identity as opposed to fighting for equality or fighting for other things. And that's the moment also where all sorts of histories are being created, new histories of Mizrahim are being created, as opposed to the earlier histories that I mentioned. And one of the things that happens now is actually you have all sorts of hatred of hegemony, okay? And so on. And what's the hegemony? The hegemony, of course, is now, borrowed from the great Marxist thinker, Antonio Gramsci, yes, who talks about the hegemony. And his idea was that, the dominant classes, are not just ruling because they have all the power, they also rule through culture, and they have a hegemonic position over culture, okay? And this is something that really, really interesting, and with that I would close, okay? What happens to Mizrahi protests, and I try to do very, very quick overview of 100 years of different types of Mizrahi critiques that produce different histories. What now we have is basically something that is called identity, and actually what is left of it is just the relational aspect of it. In other words, it's enough to say that we are not Ashkenazim. It's enough to say that we are not European. It's enough to say that we are against the hegemony, yes? And the hegemony is not meaning in the leftist Marxist Gramscian terms. Actually, it's completely confiscated and moved into different terms. And actually, this is why it is so successful today. So this is the intellectual, the most successful Mizrahi intellectual ever. I'm an aspiring Mizrahi intellectual. I will never be, as successful as Dr. Avishai Ben Chaim. And he tells you a different story. And here is I summarize it for you. There are two Israels, okay? The first is Ashkenazic. It is un-Jewish. Yes, it is rich, and it's hegemonic, and has all the power. The second is Mizrahi, it's Jewish, it's poor, and it's persecuted. Yes? And you know, how do we know it's persecuted? It's persecuted because all the Mizrahi politicians have been accused of corruption and betrayed. Aryeh Deri, Aaron Abuhatzera, and of course, Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay? Before you say Benjamin Netanyahu is actually not a Mizrahi Jew, wait. Okay? Now, and then one day, you know, and he has a lot of evidence to support that argument. Yes, Mizrahi politicians have been tried. Some of them even went to prison over questions of corruption. Ashkenazic politicians too, but you know, that's a different issue. The way in which the Ashkenazic hegemony is like enacting its power, you know, over the second Israel is by used what he calls, you know, legal violence. In other words, trying and prosecuting people. And then, you know, the people of second Israel, the Mizrahim, that's how this history is going, they had a brilliant idea. They say, why don't we find a great Ashkenazic guy and we send him as a dagger to the heart of the hegemony, okay? And that's Benjamin Netanyahu, okay? And he, you know, rises to power, in fact, as a sort of a leader of the Mizrahim, a leader of the second Israel, okay? And, you know, here's what happens. Once, you know, the first Israel discovered that, you know, that's what he's doing, yes, then they decided to put him on trial and persecute him as well, okay? Now, two things about that. First of all, the term Second Israel was used already in the 50s by critics of, you know, social policies of Israel. They already discovered that, you know, there was a second, that it creates two peoples, two collectives, two Israel. This is an article from 1951, yes. The second one is by an Iraqi journalist, you know, says the transition camp, the Ma'abara, is the second Israel. You know, reference to the fact that, you know, many Jews from Arab countries remained in the transition camps well after, you know, Ashkenazic Jews left the transition camps. Second Israel, etc., etc. He's associated with the term as if he's invented it anew. And he says basically the second Israel is using Netanyahu. Okay? He's using Netanyahu in the sense more than Netanyahu is using second Israel, you know, to gain political power. Second Israel is using Netanyahu to be its leader, to be its messiah, to realize its own aspirations for equality, etc., etc., etc. Okay? And he says that's going to be an alliance, and he used the word brit, yes, a covenant, yes, between, you know, that great leader and, you know, the oppressed second Israel, you know, and it is one of the most basic bricks and the most stable bricks, you know, in the iron wall. Yes, this is a reference to Jabotinsky, but it's a new definition of iron wall. The iron wall of the traditional national camp, of the idea of nationalism, and even also the idea of traditionalism. He takes all of these ideologies that, you know, were lurking behind, reorganizes them as one thing, nationalism, traditionalism, and national traditionalism as well, you know, as defining this new emerging collective now in Israel that is going to be taking us to a glorious thing. And here again, he says, like, this is the hegemony fights back. Okay, now they want to humiliate the prime minister of Israel and you know, make him appear in court. You know, this is when Netanyahu was actually accused and indicted, etc., etc., etc. And he says the rule of law, the hegemony, you know, are trying to basically weaken the democracy in Israel. And he even makes a reference to the concept of hegemony in the Middle Ages, in the Church of Middle Ages, you know, in the Middle that. And then he says, when the trial begins, he also says, on Sunday, I'm going to be on trial, not just Netanyahu. The trial of Netanyahu is the entire second Israel's trial, okay? It's a trial against me. The hegemony will say this against Netanyahu. Maybe even Netanyahu thinks that this is against Netanyahu. But actually, I know and I feel and I understand very well it's not his trial. It is my trial, and many people who feel like me, etc., 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 okay? So, to summarize, this is the second experiment. I started, you know, by trying to convince you that actually Mizrahi Jews are Japanese, okay? Let me now tell you that, you know, the whole thing is basically have to do with another thing. So here's the latest history of Mizrahi history, and you know, maybe you realize why it's so successful. All the others were not successful. This one's very successful. So once there was a Messiah, okay, and he showed up in southern Tel Aviv in the poor areas of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and other places as the Messiah, as the leader. He became the subject and the object of all the aspirations of Second Israel. Okay? These are real pictures. Okay? And of course, he loved all the Moroccans, and he went during the Mimuna to eat their food, and they were feeding him, and they were very, very happy with him, etc., 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 etc. Of course, let's not. There are plenty of evidence, actually, that they have a lot of anti-Mizrahi commentary in their household. Here's a site, from of Sarah Netanyahu, but that's okay. That's okay. Okay. At some point, actually, he misbehaved, and he said, "This is my Mizrahi gene." Okay, he discovered like 23andMe that they basically have some Sephardic gene or something like that. And one day he used some foul language and basically he says, that's my Mizrahi gene. That tells you something about, what he thinks about Mizrahim, etc., etc., etc. Okay, but there is even an association that is almost at the genetic basis. Okay, and here he is, again in yet another, Moroccan feast, gracing everybody with his presence, and everything is great. Okay. And then, the hegemony comes in, and when the hegemony realized that this is the Messiah that Second Israel really, really loves, they decide to put him on trial. And they do put him on trial. And even they plead, with the Supreme Court to torture him, etc., 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 and they do torture him. And then he made a comeback. Let me move back. The argument that I'm trying to make, that the reason why that book is so successful today is actually it goes to a very, very simple Jewish story. There was a great leader. He wanted to redeem the people. Evil people started persecuting him, and then he made a comeback and defeated everybody. Okay. The point is that, the certain history that we have today is the certain political moment of Israel today is accompanied by a certain culture of revenge, of resentment, yes, and also a promise of redemption that is of the wrong one. If redemption at the beginning was true equity and equality in Israel, we now have something very, very completely different than that. It's the idea that, now it is okay for us to complain. It is okay for us to actually make an argument that Second Israel is no longer, that, the society is in fact divided, and we should talk about the fact that the Jewish society that modern Israel created is divided. Yes, but somehow it is much easier for us to focus on the aspirations of one human being, yes, as the Redeemer, yeah, and because of that, he's, I think, very, very, very successful. I think it is actually derived, from religious studies to a certain extent. I didn't want to imply, that I think he's Jesus or something like that. The point is that, this is a good story about a Messiah that wanted to be good to the people, redeem them, and got persecuted for that. Thank you.
Much. I know there may be some students who need to leave or people who have to go, so feel free to get up because we went a little long, but we also, I think our speaker would be happy to answer any questions. I think I saw a hand in the back. Thank you very much. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relation between the Mizrahim and the Ashkenazim, between the British mandate, so like 1920, up to the establishment.
Yes. So just to talk about demographics, I mean, in the early stages of Zionist settlement in the land, the Sephardic community is the majority. But very quickly it becomes a minority, and more importantly, it is not dominant anymore. It's the Zionist establishment that becomes dominant over the entire Jewish presence in the land. And they are not very happy about losing status. Some of them, basically are quite annoyed. They used to be the leaders. Since the expulsions of Spain, you have the Sephardic establishment or the Sephardic rulings, under the auspices of the Ottoman Empire, pretty much leading the Jewish community there, even though they are, of course, Ashkenazim. They are perceived as the leaders. They are even more successful economically. They don't react very nicely to their political plight. Okay? And there is a great deal of resentment and so on. But the thing is that, with the rest of the masses of immigrations from Poland and then from Germany, and the rise of the establishment of the Zionist establishment, it becomes more and more Ashkenazic. Okay, so the situation here is twice. It's first of all, you have an old, very old presence that feels that it's actually now being overwhelmed by other people who are coming in, with new ideologies, and they become dominant. They are even part of the government, etc., etc. And they are also the leaders of the movement that is settling in the land. Okay, I wouldn't say that there are social issues yet. I wouldn't say that there are social issues yet. Most of the tensions, there are tensions, but most of the tensions are about what to do with the rest of the population there, i.e. the Palestinians, and who's going to lead. Now, the question of the leadership is settled very, very quickly. Zionist socialism takes over in the 20s, and from there on remains the leader until 1977 continuously. Okay. The other problem is what to do with the Palestinians. And I think the people who lived there at that time during mandatory Palestine, they feel that they need to choose. Okay. Relationship with the Arabs, were friendly to the degree that, communities that live together are different, have sometimes tensions, but they had working mechanisms of communication. I'm not in any way trying to make a rosy, ideal past between, Jewish presence in the Middle East, including Palestine, as opposed to Europe. But it was far better, okay, and far friendlier. Okay, but the problem is that with the rise of Zionism in the land, these people feel, and the rest of the Middle Eastern Jews as well, they need to choose. And in fact, they need to choose, but in fact, they don't really have a choice. They don't really have a choice. The conflict, the rising conflict between Arabs and Jews, between Arabs and Zionists, puts them in the middle. And then at the end of the day, not only those who lived in the land before 1948, but every other Jew in the Middle East found themselves having to leave the Arab Middle East, as a result of this conflict, whether they wanted to or didn't. Yes, very, very few stayed. So in a way, we need to bring in the question, the Arab question and the Palestinian question into this as well, because it's always there, and they are in the middle. Okay, that's affecting that. Of course, there are social gaps, but they are not yet pronounced because there's no promise of equality. The state of Israel was also founded on the idea of Jewish solidarity and the promise of equality. That's the thing that Avraham Abbas was so disappointed about. He says that's the promise that was betrayed already 10 years after the creation of Israel. Okay. Yeah. That's very, very true. Yes. In 1977, I was like a serious Begin supporter, because Begin was actually very, very good at doing something that Netanyahu is much better at today. Okay? And to a certain extent, I would say that it was, to a degree, more sincere. And yes, the main part of it is, the hostility and resentment that the Black Panthers, expressed in 1971 did transform into support of the Likud in 1977. That is without doubt. And more so even in 1981, where the Likud actually consolidates its position as the representative of the Mizrahim in Israel. Yes. He supported it at the beginning, yes, but later no. I mean, Begin himself, presented himself as a simple Jew, like the simple Jews there. He was talking about that. He used a lot of rhetoric, kind of even inflammatory rhetoric, not as much as Netanyahu. Netanyahu really speaks into this conflict as he was a leader of the Black Panthers. Okay, I mean, it's unbelievable the way he speaks about language that people like me were never allowed to express. Okay. Begin did speak about that, and there was a little bit of a cult of Begin as well. It goes back, to some relationship during mandatory Palestine, between the Jewish right and the Zionist right, and some of the Sephardic communities, particularly in Jerusalem. Okay, there are people who emphasize this more than I do. Okay, but so you can say that Begin is a precursor of the present moment. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about another branch of Ashkenazic European Zionism that presents itself, as the representative of a large collective. Okay. Now, maybe it's true. I don't think so, but maybe it's true. Okay. But the fact of the matter is that just as you explain hegemony in this way, you can also say that this is also part of the hegemony to stay in power, to say, oh, we represent you. Okay. You can say that Begin, in a certain way, was sincere in certain social policies. They did try. I think they failed. I mean, history shows that they failed because the gaps are persistent, even into the third generation, maybe even through the fourth generation. Between the centers and the periphery, and between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. If I had another hour, I would talk about Begin too. Yes. The violence of 1929, I can only speak about it here through the lenses of the topic that I would to stay in. There's a great book about 1929 by Hillel Cohen, who actually emphasizes the Mizrahi element there and so on. But the interesting part is that, when I presented Ben Kiki, I did say that he predicted something like this is going to happen, at least in one aspect. He says the creation of a modern society here that understands itself to be European severs the relation, the traditional ways that we communicate with the Muslim population in this land. And if there will be violence, we have no way to put an end to it. Okay? And one of the things that you see that you have violence between Jews and Arabs there, you see that the British mishandle this, they are clueless, they don't know what to do. And the Zionist leadership doesn't know how to talk to the Arab leadership. Worse, you have Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, like Nissim Malul and others, who say, like, look, we are local, we know, let us represent, let us speak to the other side, yes? And they are disregarded, okay? There's an episode that I'm writing in the book, I don't mention it here. Eliyahu Eliashar, one of the old leaders of the old Sephardic Yishuv, when you have Yudam Leib Magnus and other intellectuals come from America and they start to talk about peace and communication with the Arabs, he says, now you're coming. We've been saying this for 20 years and you've been ignoring us. Okay, so I'm not going to blame anybody on 1929. Okay, but I will say that it represents one of the aspects of it is the tragic loss of the traditional ways in which communities who are not the same used to communicate and mediate in moments of tension. That is clearly lost. What? Yes. In what way?
In preventing any kind of resolution.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that at all. I mean, first of all, we are now talking about not processes, but we're talking about solutions, okay? And people like to quarrel about solutions, but solutions belong to imagined futures, okay? I don't think that there is a Mizrahi collective goal concerning the solution, of the conflict, in Palestine, Israel today. I don't think that there is one. There are many, many streams, and there are many different ideas about that. If you can say one thing continuous, you can say that what you may call the present Mizrahi left is people who basically say, let's communicate, and we maybe represent a way to communicate. Okay, but it's not clear at all, that the Mizrahi right, wants any other solution. I don't know if there's any ideologues there or philosophers who articulate a solution. Ben Haim himself has a solution, okay, but that's not a solution for the Arab population or for the conflict itself. He has a solution for the strife among Israelis. He says, like, you all have to be, second Israel, and unite around whom I try to depict here as a Messiah. He basically comes up with the story of redemption. I think that's why he's so successful. Yeah.
Clarify the way you're using the term Sephardi as within the Sephardic collective that you talk about, or do you see it as like alphabetizing the Ashkenazi primary?
Yeah. Okay, first of all, it's a very, very good question. I'm grateful, that now I have a chance to actually go into it. So it seems to me that, first of all, there is the Sephardic in the sense of people of Iberian descent. Okay. Most of the Sephardic Jews, in the end of the day, came to identify as Mizrahim or with Mizrahim. Liturgically, when you talk about Sephardic Jews, then you include everybody who is not, following the minhag of Ashkenaz or the liturgy of Ashkenaz, and that has nothing to do with ethnicity. It has to do with, the way you practice Jewish law. So in that regard, in these two regards, the word Mizrahi, Sephardi, the terms are interchangeable. Okay, so until the 1970s, when you say Sephardic Jews, you meant Mizrahi Jews. Okay. And since the 1980s, when you say Mizrahi Jews, you also mean also Sephardic Jews. Okay, I would say that that's the thing, because one of the things that happened is, people noticed that, in fact, Jews of Iberian descent who follow Sephardic liturgy are actually quite a small minority in the several millions of Jews who actually come from, 9 Arab countries and 2 Muslim countries, etc. So the terms are interchangeable. It is, to a degree, confusing, and they are not exactly synonymous. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to, I'm speaking a little bit from my own experience as an immigrant to Israel. I came from Argentina.
Yes.
And I have friends who came from all over the world, right? Including from Arab countries. And we study a lot in the Hebrew program and even in the Hebrew classes about Olim Israel, immigration to Israel in general. And I was wondering what the data show in terms of gaps, for example, in the Russian immigration and the Ethiopian immigration.
Absolutely. Well, here's the thing. Yes, there are serious gaps. Okay. And in fact, if you look at the two communities that emigrate to Israel in the most recent years, which are, the Ethiopians and the Russians, you could say both of them do not do well for different reasons. With the Russian, in the Russian sector, there's always a question of, of religion, okay, which is now again is under attack. Yes. You can say that, the Ethiopians, fare the worst. Okay, and this is where you have, questions of skin color, questions of race, questions of discrimination, and more and more and more and more. Far more than in the Russian sector. But the truth is that, the way Israel absorbs, the communities that move en masse after 1948, it doesn't do very well. Now, when we say it doesn't do very well, we say as opposed to what? And my point is, as opposed to the promise. Maybe if this was a neutral state without any ideologies, we would still face the same reality. But we wouldn't be speaking about it in terms of, betrayal. We wouldn't be saying, okay, immigrants emigrate, they suffer. That's the first generation of any immigration. And then we begin to think why the second and the third generations are still suffering or still experiencing inequality. But the whole element of, the ingathering ideology would be gone. Yes. What I think is going on right now, and what was always there, is the sense of betrayal. In other words, that these people were betrayed because there was a certain promise that the Jewish state delivered in terms of Jewish solidarity, in terms of, becoming a haven for Jews, like translating the old communal solidarity that small communities experience into something that we can call a polity, with a national framework. That's the thing that was betrayed. Okay. Now, the fact of the matter is that Mizrahim tend to feel that sense of betrayal, whether they're on the left and recently of the right as well, much more. Okay? Apparently, I don't know. I can't speak for Ashkenazim. Apparently, Ashkenazim don't feel that betrayed. They think, that they are redeemed, that they became a general Israeli person. Okay? They don't insist that, they are different than the rest of Israelis. Okay? So in that context, it is. And you're right about the fact that we need to ask, how do other communities, such as the Russians and the Ethiopians, feel in the same way? Do they feel betrayed? Okay.
There were other children who were second, third, fourth generation of Israel, who were in a different, situation than us, that we were new immigrants. So it's not only about where you are coming from, but the fact that you are coming from.
Yes. Well, I mean, there have been some studies that looked at it in kind of situations that you can really make a meaningful comparison. So I'm going to mention two cases. One is the case of the Polish Gomulka immigration to Israel. Okay, so in 1953, Gomulka was the communist leader of Poland, allows Polish Jews to emigrate to Israel. They come en masse. Okay. You have evidence that the government basically discussed how long they're going to stay in the transition camps. By that time, Iraqi Jews were already living in the transition camps for at least 2 years. Okay? But Golda Meir says, these people, the Polish Jews who are about to come now, they cannot survive in the tents. Okay? As opposed to people who came from, middle classes in Baghdad, as if they could survive in the tents. So here's a fact: they come in '53, and within 6 months, within 6 months, all of them are out of the camps. Okay, that's number one case. The second case is the studies by one of the interesting sociologists in Israel. She passed away, Tikva Darwish. Tikva Darwish studied how the Romanians and the Iraqis did in Israel after they emigrated. Why? Because both of them emigrated around the same time. So you can actually take the two communities and you say, okay, both arrived in Israel at the same time. Let's see over the years how they fared. Okay? And one of the things that you can see that among the Iraqis, you see a decline in the sense that, people who are actually grew up in Iraq and reached a certain age that they could go to school were far more educated than, younger Iraqis who came to Israel and were denied education. Okay? And then the entire community is actually in decline in all parameters. Okay? To a certain extent, Jews in Iraq did better in Iraq than in Israel in terms of education. Okay? Romanians who arrive in the same time and presumably are treated the same way by the state and enjoy the same limited resources that everybody else does, actually did much better.
They left
Okay.
the transit.
And they left the transition camps later. This is something very, very important. Okay. Housing in Israel was a tool of social engineering. Where they put you is determine the way your identity determines your life and determines your future, and later on, etc., etc., etc. Okay, and one of the things that you see that there's a very, very deliberate policies of settlement where you settle people. Okay, this is why, by the way, I think housing is always one of the most painful issues, and most of the violence that is and the protest that is going on until identity becomes the most important issue, are about housing. Okay, and everything that is derived from that. Okay. If you ask me from my point of view, I think that the whole identity business is the worst, because that becomes a form of expression that is the goal unto itself. It's supposed to solve all your problems with simply you identify as Mizrahi, okay? But it costs nobody nothing, okay? You don't have to invest in that. You don't have to change, social policies in Israel, and make them more equitable, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Now I'm curious where you live, because I had a lot of friends from Argentina, in Jerusalem. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. He, to a certain extent, he ignores. I think that he includes the Ethiopians within that, within the Mizrahi population, but not the Russians. Okay, the emphasis on traditionalism, which is, in my opinion, would be a fake term. Is exclusive. It's designed to say, okay, Ashkenazic Jews are too secular. They have adopted, some sort of materialistic view of life, whereas we follow a certain idea of a Jewish tradition, and we're in a certain Jewishness that, they no longer have. Okay. Of course, I think it is made up. There are, secular Mizrahi Jews, or all sorts of things. You have ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi Jews, etc. It's not. There's a whole spectrum. The way it always was in the Jewish people, okay, in that sense. Yes, I am struggling with the success of this message, because one of the ironies is it actually capitalizes on Mizrahi messages of the past. The idea that actually there are two collectives and not one, that the idea that there is a Jewish unity and solidarity is fake. Yes, the whole idea of Second Israel is basically says there's no such thing, okay? But then, the idea here is that, it's actually what we have here is a redemptive history, yes? That, you can find your redemption and your expressions through one person, And the identity of that person matters to me less than the fact that, this is not the solution to the problem, Yeah. The Mizrahi identity? Yes and no. I think it was beneficial in the sense that, it allowed people to organize, and gave them a sense of unity in communal struggles. But once identity became the purpose of the struggles, yes, then we lost everything. Because what the government did, what the hegemony did, it says, okay, you want to talk about identity? Let me give you your identity. Let me go and celebrate your holidays, celebrate your traditions, celebrate whatever, talk about how you are oppressed and do nothing socially, okay? And the contract here is very, very simple. I'm going to talk about myself, about Mizrahi pride all day. I'm going to be proud about your Mizrahi proud, and I'm not going to change anything, in terms of the persistent social gaps in Israel, okay? And also, we will all pretend that that's the only problem that the Israeli society have, which is, of course, not true. Yeah, I'm going to say one word here. One of the things that is often missed is that, the communities that came from different places had their own histories within the countries, and they had their own differences as well. And even they had classes, and they had, class resentment and class differences and so on and so forth. The idea here is that Israel kind of flattened that, is also not true. Okay. In fact, I should thank you for that, because it's a very, very important point. We should not assume that all Mizrahim basically were all the same way. They were all religious or all secular. All of them were middle class. All of them were poor class. It was a very, very diverse society, just as European Jewry was. Yes. Yeah.